Well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to be back for our next topic of the equestrian pelvic floor. So Allie Baier here, and I am the owner and physical therapist that works through my company Equipped, going on site and helping people with a plethora of postural needs or injury recovery, or just trying to really help their performance in unique ways from my physical therapist perspective. And talking about unique ways and unique perspectives, the pelvic floor by far is one of the most underappreciated, and I'm not going to say misunderstood, just I don't think people have taken the time to stop and pause and learn about their pelvic floor. So it is a really fun topic because I feel like people come out of this lecture in particular with just like a whole new area to have concern about, and either you're excited by that or maybe you're overwhelmed, like another aid I need to think of. But it's a great conversation to have. We have a nice size group tonight, so any sort of questions you have along the way, type it in the chat and I can answer it as close to when your question comes up. You can also raise your hand with the opportunity to have. What's going to happen is Molly's going to be watching all that, and she'll interrupt and either ask you to turn on your video and we can have a conversation more naturally with the video, or I'll just answer it as I'm having a lecture through the rest of it if you put it through chat. So with that, we're going to get started, and at the end I'll have time for questions as well. And the other thing I'll say is the nature of this conversation of the pelvic floor. You might not want to be airing all your pelvic floor history in front of these other people, which is totally understood. So please know that I'll have ways that you guys can reach out, whether it's a quick phone call, an email, something like that. I do want your questions to be answered, but I also do want you to have some comfort and privacy if your question is that nature. So all right. This whole conversation came up for me specifically when I had my first daughter. She just turned 3. And when I was going sitting on Google, with my little newborn in my lap going, well, when can I go back and ride? I Googled returning to riding after pregnancy or postpartum, and there were a lot of just stories and people's anecdotal support of I got back 2 weeks later, or it took me 2 months, or it just was all over the place. And it really does depend based on did you ride up into delivery, or are you just getting into riding after being off for a long time? So I understood that there was a lot of difference in the answer, but what I didn't like is there was nothing really scientifically based, medically supported, or guided. And it was just a lot of like, strap on all your extra pads and get ready to pee yourself in the saddle. And I'm like, that wasn't even a positive thing to look for. So it got me on the whole train of the pelvic floor as my own postpartum recovery, and trying to help those that have had children recently. But here's the cool part. Say you've never had children, or it was decades ago, your pelvic floor still can be a riding aid, and it still has been elaborated in many ways with my clients of using your seat, and specifically the undercarriage of your seat, in a brand new way that your horse is like, oh, beautiful. That's the part of you that sits on me. I can listen to that. So I just wanted to point it out. You do not have to have any sort of postpartum experience to benefit from today's talk, but specifically, there is a whole talk that I do in collaboration with another physical therapist who is a pelvic health specialist. That's all she sees. And that talk is on my website. It's just a little talk you can purchase for a couple bucks and go through it at your own pace. So if you know people at your barns that have had babies and are going, what do I do? It's really specific, exercise, timelines, the whole thing. But today will be much more broad in application. All right, we are going to do the kind of token thing that talks do, which is like, make sure you have the support of your physician before participating. Um, and I understand that, especially in a postpartum perspective, but I also think this is an area where a lot of other organ systems lie, meaning your bladder, your bowel, your intestines. You can have a whole slew of other medical conditions going on, whether it's IBS or Crohn's disease or consistent or persistent bladder infections. There are things that are totally outside of the realm of a physical therapist that certainly become involved. So I really do mean that. If you have other systemic things going on, we want to have those in a pretty stable place before you expect to get on the horse and start to, have fine-tuned control of your pelvic floor. This area is also highly connected to your nervous system. So if you think about the phrase being, oh, they're so anal retentive. Well, I literally do mean your pelvic floor is probably working really hard with your high strung nervous system to contain things under pressure. So it is just, unfortunately, also an area of distinct trauma, whether that's sexual abuse or the trauma of having a baby, or the trauma of, I've had a lot of people kind of underestimate what incontinence is in terms of a trauma to your emotional and physical well-being as you age. So this is a place that, whether we like it or not, we can't just work these muscles and be in a tense place in our body or in our mind in other places. It is very, very connected to the rest of us. Then finally, the work that I do when I'm on site with clients is all external, meaning there are physical therapists that do internal pelvic floor work for a variety of reasons. But then the way we're going to assess ourselves today and the way I do out at the farm is all externally. So, just by feeling your tushy and funny positions as you're sitting on your hands, that's what we're going to do today. But it's important that you really feel these muscles in action correctly today, and to make it applicable to your riding. Feeling that, if you go like, okay, wow, I got nothing, I have no clue if my body's doing this right or wrong, don't hesitate to get involved then with a physical therapist for at least one visit to know and really understand these pieces of your pelvic floor. Okay, the purpose of your pelvic floor. I don't think many people realize their pelvic floor had such purpose until something went wrong with your bowel or bladder or sexual function. And then obviously pregnancy, it's like, oh, that part of me. Okay. It's kind of a slap in the face to your pelvic floor and your awareness of it. But if you think about its main job, it is to sling underneath you and suspend all your abdominal organs into your body. Real specifically, the pelvic organs. So, the uterus, the bladder, and the tail end of your bowel is within that pelvic bowl. And then above that rests, the rest of your intestines and organs. And it is a lot of sustained pressure on your pelvic floor. It is a set of muscles that by far are supposed to be endurance muscles. Then real specifically, there's a lot of sphincteric, so your sphincters, sphincteric control of your bowel and your bladder. It, of course, has sexual function. And then lastly, it is, and this is where it matters the most for riding as well, is the pressure management. So we have the diaphragm, where this lady's top hand is, that diaphragm dome on the top. And then the bottom, that pelvic floor sling, this contains and then your abdominals wrap around. This is a container. And this container comes under pressure in a lot of ways. And how well you manage that pressure has a lot to do with how mobile and following your seat and the rest of your lumbar spine is. And then also it has a huge role when you are experiencing things like incontinence. If you have poor pressure management, liquid's got to go somewhere and they tend to leak out. So pressure management becomes a really important concept for incontinence. We're going to then kabow anatomy from the bottom view of your pelvic floor. Let me move my little video out of the way. Things I want you guys to understand with this, the picture on the left is the most, I'm going to say the most superficial or directly under the skin, those muscles. And these are all the muscles that from the outside through, through thinner clothing, we can actually palpate and find all of these structures and all of these muscles. But I want you to know that the pelvic floor is actually 3 layers of muscles. So I have a model that is going to give you guys maybe a little bit of different reference. So this pelvis, this is the front, this is your pubic bone. And then you have the sides of your, what we would call like your hips, or for some people, like your waist would be right above. So these are your 2 sides of your hip bones. And then these are your seat bones. These are what you sit on. On the back side is your sacrum, with the very bottom being your tailbone. So then when you have the underside view, which to reference to what you're looking at on the computer screen as well, these muscles run on all kinds of different angles, and each layer, so it's actually 3 layers thick of muscles. Each layer has some fibers that go front to back, some that go on oblique angles, and then some go directly right to left. And then you have all the muscles that circle around all the pelvic floor openings to create an opening and enclosing sphincteric function. So there's a lot. I want us to know, we can think of it broadly, like it's all going to contract or it's all going to relax, but you actually can, and we'll get to this later, sort of pick and choose which muscles we use. Maybe I want to use more of the ones to try not to go pee, that feeling, versus the posterior ones are more like trying to withhold bowel material. You can try to use more of the right fibers versus the left fibers. So it's a little bit more dynamic than just one sling of muscle tissue. So 3 layers in all kinds of directions. The depth of that, if you want to know how thick that is, so you can take a look at your own finger and that first, second, third knuckle. That's how deep these muscles are. So it is a thick, strong sling. And why? Because it holds your whole abdominal contents, and it does that all day. So you need a lot of layering of muscle tissue to really support and do its job properly. What I want us to do is, while we're sitting here, if you're on like a super squishy chair, you might need to use, switch chairs, but I want to have us sit on our hands on our seat bones. And it doesn't feel great to do this for your fingers' sake, so we're not going to be here long, but I want you to find your right and left seat bone, and you're going to look on the picture. Those are called your ischial tuberosities. And the picture with all the numbers, the number 9 and 3, those muscle fibers anchor off of your right and left seat bone. And then where the number 12 is, that's your pubic bone. And then where the number 6 is, that's your tailbone. So you can kind of get a gauge that if I put my fingers just within my 2 seat bones, I'm going to be roughly between numbers 9, or like on numbers 9 and 3. And if I'm a little too far forwards or a little too far back, I'm still landing and kind of in the safe zone of my pelvic floor without getting too close to all of those highly personal openings. So that is the place where it is most easily accessed. I'm going to have you guys just pick one hand, so you're not putting so much pressure on your fingers. And just, again, feel that bone. So we're on here with one finger, and then you're just going to sort of shift into where now you're on squishy muscle. And it doesn't matter which side you do, just sit on one. You're going to kind of off weight that finger so it doesn't hurt so much, and then just fall right off of it, and you'll land right within the pelvic floor muscles. And this is how we're going to feel when we get to doing like activation and relaxation. That's going to be the place where we we'll palpate that on ourselves. It's very, very easy to do this when you lay down. as long as you can kind of reach to that same point. And then that way you're not having your fingers blood flow cut off. But it's also a different place because you don't have gravity compressing your abdominal organs on your pelvic floor. So they sometimes have a little bit more movement and excursion when you lay down. So everything we do today, I do encourage people that are struggling to feel effort or feel activity to try it laying on your backs later tonight. This also on the right picture that I have, there are these shiny white things. These are ligaments, and the sacrotuberous ligament is a really important one because when people have falls and they land on their tailbone, um, that fiber, so it's on here as well on my model too. So that tailbone, it goes from the sit bone to the tailbone. And these are really strappy and strong, but you can somewhat massage and release some of these. You can create a little bit more stretch to them, but in general, we want ligaments to sort of be firm and stabilizing. But when you have that tailbone perhaps too tucked under, deviating off to the right or left, maybe it even fractured, that sacrotuberous ligament is a really interesting place to try to restore equal tension so it can stabilize and let that tailbone kind of heal in a centered way. And why is that so important? Well, if you go back to looking at the picture with all the numbers, if the number 6, if the actual bone were shifted even a half an inch one way or the other, that totally pulls on the vast majority of one side of your pelvic floor, and it's going to slack the other half of your pelvic floor. And a muscle that isn't in the middle of its length is not ideally strong. So when a muscle is overstretched, it's weak. And when a muscle is slacked, it's weak. And we don't want a weak pelvic floor. So that tailbone, it's a really important hinge point for that whole sling underneath. The other very important hinge point is your pubic symphysis, so the very front bone. And if you're interested in palpating that, you just are going to follow your abdominal muscles all the way down, down, down until you hit something that's bone. And that's the top of your pubic symphysis. It's not as low as you might think it is. So down, 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 and then boom, that little shelf you land on is your pubic symphysis. And all the abdominal muscles attached there. So it's very important if you want an active, evenly active core, that pubic symphysis, both the right and left half of it, are equal. And if you can imagine this pelvis, one of the halves rotated, so I'm going to just be my fingers now, a half of that pelvis rotated. Now my pubic symphysis is crooked. So you can now find multiple reasons why that pelvic floor might be a little bit dysfunctional. If you have uneven leg lengths, rotations in your hips, a fall history on the tailbone, all of those just structurally change the tension on these muscles. We'll get into the behavior of the muscles and like what it should feel like when they do right and wrong. But just the anatomy of it, I do think is important because you might be that person like, oh, my legs are different lengths, or, oh yeah, one hip's always higher than the other. That might give you a little empathy with yourself if you struggle today in perceiving even and present muscle function. So let's then talk about all the things not involved in riding. So I will say this talk in general, since usually people know so little about the pelvic floor, there's a lot of describing its function for normal life. And then about the last third is all applications for riding. But a large majority of people just need to think about this stuff and master it with standing, walking, lifting, before you get on a moving object with a mind of its own and you're trying to coordinate all your other aids. Just take some time to really integrate our knowledge in non-riding aspects for quite a while before you expect success on the horse. But things we do look for is that you should be able to stand and walk all day. I shouldn't say like consistently, but think about a horse show day, or maybe a trainer that's nonstop on their feet. We do want to have that full day tolerance with the ability for it to be uneven ground. and then doing things like just straight standing and stairs. All of those are sustained pressures on the pelvis, maybe with other movement muscles supporting it. But when you just straight stand, a lot of the effort and endurance is just on your pelvic floor. Um, so you should be able to do all that with kind of no leakage, no pain, um, and with a sense of like, if I wanted to, I could feel and perceive my pelvic floor. If I did a Kegel or a Kegel, which we'll learn about, yeah, I can do that as I'm doing the stairs. Yeah, I can do that as I'm bathing my horse. That should feel achievable for you. The normal, like what is considered normal for bowel, bladder, and sexual function. When it comes to, if you think about like how many times you urinate in a day, 5 to 8 times of going to the restroom. So that's roughly about every 2 to 4 hours would be considered normal time for that bladder to fill, for your brain to get a signal that it's full, and then for a signal to go down to your pelvic floor and say, um, you know, A, I'm in a good place. I'm right by a restroom. I can relax my pelvic floor. Or, you know, I'm riding a horse in the middle of a dressage test. No, today, right now, is not a good time for that bladder to empty. So that is a feedback loop. My bladder fills, boom, a signal goes to my brain. My brain then has to decide, is this a good time or not? It sends a signal down to my pelvic floor to contract if it's not okay. And then by the time you're sitting down to void, then that is another loop from your brain back down to your pelvic floor to relax. And when those muscles relax, then you can urinate. And then a fourth loop occurs, which is go back up and then come back down to close off and stop emptying that bladder or bowel. So 4 loops of feedback go on. So it's a complicated little system, but nonetheless, every 2 to 4 hours. And then when you do urinate, this is just fascinating to me. This was important for me when I was pregnant, because I didn't want to be like, oh, I'm pregnant, I got to pee all the time. I don't want to train those loops to become oversensitive. But when you urinate, it should be for at least 8 seconds. Tells you that that bladder actually reached a point that was worthy of being emptied. A lot of times we mess those loops up in many, many ways, but it's like the bladder was only a third full and you only peed for like 3 seconds. Well, did you really need to use the bathroom? I'm sure it felt like it, but ideally, no, you didn't need to do that. Your bladder had more capacity and had the opportunity to hold more urine. And if you always empty and always empty and always empty, you actually start to get a weaker bladder muscle. So you don't want to be that person that's like going all the time, just in case, just in case. And what do we do from a very young age? Children are like, okay, go to the bathroom before we go, just in case. And it's like, no, no, that's messing up the loops. You can think to yourself, I haven't used the restroom for the past 2 hours. I'm about to go. Yeah, I will use the restroom. But if you just went 30 minutes ago, don't go again just because you're about to go on a car ride or just because you're about to get on your horse. Those are very, very dangerous places to start messing those feedback loops up. There should be no pain or discomfort with urination. And then from a bowel standpoint, having bowel movements every day to every other day is considered normal. Again, no pain or discomfort. You don't need to kind of wiggle or maneuver yourself to have bowel or urine leave. And then lastly, you should also feel like, especially with bowel movements, that you have an ability to say, nope, this isn't the right place for a little bit longer than you can say, nope, this isn't the right place to go to pee. So, up to a good hour of sort of saying like, I'm not in the right place for that to happen. Lastly, there should be no pain with sexual function. And if you're not a sexually active person, the other thing to consider is like when you have your pelvic exams, like your annual OBGYN visit, there should also be no pain or discomfort with that. pushing, pulling, and carrying really tap into the pressure management that our pelvic floor is in charge of. So think of, carrying your saddle plus your grooming bucket, and or maybe you're taking 2 water buckets, just that overload of pressure. And especially if we put it like directly on our trunk and have, downward pressure through our abdomen, that pelvic floor really does need to be able to manage that added oomph. Maybe not for a long time, but for the few steps that we're going to be doing that. Additionally, if you are someone who has maybe some concerns about back injuries, I'm going to point out on this model, your spine these are the bottom 2 vertebrae of your spinal column that would come right up. Part of the benefit of good pressure management is you can imagine, your abdominals wrapping around here, your diaphragm's up top, the pelvic floor is down below. I have this whole balloon, if you will, of muscle that goes around and encases the spine. Well, let's say I have a lot of pressure in this balloon. I have, a very stiff, non-moving diaphragm. I'm clenching with my core muscles and I'm death gripping with my pelvic floor. Well, that spinal column receives that overload of pressure, and it can increase the discomfort that your spine feels, the nerves that leave the spine, the discs between the spine. So an interesting symptom that I'll hear from people who have some nerve inflammation or some disc irritation in their spine is that it hurts more with things like coughing and sneezing, that pressure increase. That's also why we are told to not hold our breath while we lift. So I wanted to mention that as it relates back into spine discomfort. The breathing patterns that you have during the day, as you walk, as you carry, as you are doing the non-riding aspects, we really want to see normal, regular breathing patterns. If you're like, well, what's regular? What's normal? Go onto the IDCTA site and we will have that first breathing talk that I did back in December. That will describe what normal is, but it is the most linked up behavior between your pelvic floor. Let me do this here, between your pelvic floor and the rest of your bodies with your diaphragm, that there's this synchronicity between the 2 types of domes, our pelvic floor and our diaphragm. So if our diaphragm's not functioning well, maybe it's doing the opposite, like this. That is a recipe for a squished, highly pressurized abdomen. And this is a recipe for a really weak pelvic floor. So when we don't have that up and down together, we're adding a lot more problems to our pelvic floor. And we become vulnerable when we then have to do a big movement with breathing, such as coughing, laughing, sneezing. Okay. I'm pausing and just making sure no one has questions before we get into everything that goes wrong. And then we're going to go, I think we're going to do one more thing before I go to this slide, so I'm going to go back, but I'm not hearing questions from Molly.
None have come in so far.
Okay, good. So when I say like what's normal and is my pelvic floor working correctly, and why can I say that? The harmony, I'm just going to say the harmony between your diaphragm and your pelvic floor. Let's do a little self-assessment before we get into all the things that can go wrong. And then we'll talk about, the answers to these questions here. But I want us to go back to our sitting on one hand. For those that are like, I don't want to sit on my hand, you can lay down on the floor right now with your knees bent, feet on the ground, knees bent, laying on your back. And we're going to pick a seat bone. And we're going to go and feel just within. And as you can just think about at rest, I'm not trying to contract anything. I'm not trying to relax anything. I'm not even thinking too much about what the rest of my body's doing, but can I squish on this side and feel like there is some squishiness? Or do I feel like I'm hitting a big giant wall? There should be a little bit of some give and softness because, again, we're talking to a pretty big, thick muscle, but it's still a muscle. It's still squishy. And you could also compare both sides and say, at rest, is one half of my pelvic floor with a higher muscle tone or tension compared to the other? And then I want you to just take a big, big inhale. However you breathe is how you breathe. Don't worry about if you're breathing right or wrong. Um, so nose breathing, mouth breathing, I don't care. Just a big inhale. And tell me, or don't tell me, think to me, what happens to your pelvic floor? Do you feel like that tension level, that was resting tension, did that change? Did it get more firm or less firm? So on inhale, what do you feel happening?
We do
And
have a
then,
question now.
okay, go for
Okay,
it.
there's actually two of them. Um, the first one is, so far, all the information seems to address women. How does it affect men? Also, how is the pelvic floor affected by a cesarean?
Really great questions. So men have all the same pelvic floor muscles. They just don't have the um, vaginal opening. So that area of muscle and that sphincteric control isn't there. However, all the pelvic floor muscles are the same. The anatomy, we'll talk about this too. The anatomy of how they sit on the saddle is a little bit different, like what makes contact with the saddle. But there are tons of men that seek out pelvic floor care. Maybe not even, you know, known to us because it's a fairly private thing. You don't really talk to others, but hey, do you go to a pelvic therapist? But think about all the versions of prostate dysfunction, maybe even after prostate surgeries. So they can have the same bowel and bladder incontinence issues. So in that capacity, anatomically the same, and certainly in the function, all the same function. And then the other question was the cesarean. After cesarean, that abdominal wraparound of core muscles, depending on how long ago you had it, hopefully that was a horizontal incision that was made fairly low. Well, that's like having this balloon and slicing through it and waiting for that scar tissue to close. And if it has weakness, like this is the front now, if there's that weakness of the abdominal muscles where it can't contain, you will have probably an increased desire to clench and hold in other areas. So maybe you'll start holding your breath. Maybe you'll start overactivating your pelvic floor to make up for the weakness of your abdominals. But here's the bummer, you then were just pregnant, so your pelvic floor is likely weak and your abdominals are weak. So that absolutely is where we see an overactivation of back muscles, jaw tension, breath holding. And then, unfortunately, you can't perhaps do a bunch of laughing before there is some leakage. So in that capacity, it changes and weakens your pressure management. Once that scar tissue's there and the core muscles are sort of reactivated, hopefully it's been in conjunction, like in harmony with the pelvic floor, kind of retraining that all systems contract and support at one time. So that coordination as it comes back is really important, and you can go to have a fully functional, well pressure managed system.
We have one more question.
Go
I
for
do
it.
weightlifting. I do 105 on a deadlift and a squat of 110. Any impact on the pelvic floor?
Oh gosh, yes. Yes, for sure. Impact being you are asking it to contain you plus all that 100 plus weight, and to do it usually through a movement. So you're going to have to make sure that that pelvic floor has enough stamina to do everything during the day, and these little peaks of increased activity to ensure that you're not dropping and weakening within your pelvic floor. How do you know? Well, in a really obvious way, you'd have leakage. But in a less obvious way, you might be over contracting. I'm going to point to this area, over contracting in your upper abdominals because the pelvic floor is dropping. That's less pressure control. So you're going to have to come on with more pressure control from your upper abdomen. You might then feel like you are tempted to hold your breath. You might have increased jaw tension. Those would be other places where you're going to add activity if your pelvic floor isn't ready for what you're asking. But if you feel like you can breathe normally, you don't have any leakage issues, then your pelvic floor is happy to have the added challenge, which is great. Good. Really good questions. The breath, the inhale, we just assessed what do we feel happening with the inhale. The other piece is what do we feel happening with an exhale. Speaking of lifting, we usually try to do our effort or our big lifts on an exhale. So we aren't over pressurizing our system. We're letting some air out. So it's interesting to think, well, what's happening at my pelvic floor when I have that exhale? So again, just within the seat bones, what happens on inhale, what happens on exhale? We'll talk about what should and shouldn't happen in a minute, but just answer your questions to yourself. And then we're going to try a contraction of your pelvic floor, a Kegel, whatever you want to call it. So I'm here and I'm going to say, don't pee. What do I feel happening? Do I feel like my finger holds its ground? Does my finger drop? Does my finger rise up? And once I do that contraction, then how long can I hold that contraction before I'm noticing that that tone change has gone back to kind of its resting squishiness? So we do that contraction, try not to pee, and how long can you hold? How long can you hold? How long can you hold? Be interesting to know what's normal. And you will know that. And then we're going to go back to just relaxing. And does relaxation feel any different than contracting? Because it's just as important to know when your pelvic floor is off as when it's on. And if we want to be a following, receiving rider, being like, oh, I feel like their spine is lifting me up into the saddle, or oh, I feel like their rib cage is shifted right or left, or they're rotating under the saddle unevenly. I need to receive with a relaxed pelvic floor. So you're going to get a lot of information from your horse when you can relax your pelvic floor. You're going to influence your horse when you can contract your pelvic floor. Okay, we'll then go into what goes wrong. Not a whole ton, but I think enough because these things come up. Maybe they haven't come up for you yet. So you're going to have information if it happened, or maybe these are things you struggle with already. Incontinence is by far the most common issue that can come up after and I can't even just say pregnancy because there are plenty of teens that go through incontinence, especially if you get into the world of like gymnastics and dance, and where you have these really, really high intensity activities that tend to have some body image issues that go along with it. So altered breathing patterns, sucking, holding it in, compounded with a lot of force of landing. So incontinence certainly can come up through adolescence, but then yes, after pregnancy, and then just throughout aging, I think, you lose inherent strength if you're not careful. So urge incontinence is the simple fact that you have the strong, quick urge to use the restroom. Like there's no feedback loop to your brain that says my bladder's full. Oh, that happens. Sorry, the bladder sends a signal to the brain, and then it's like, boom, I'm peeing. So you don't have the time to get to the restroom. You don't have that feedback loop that says, wait. And that can be for urine or bowel. Stress incontinence is a little different. Just daily life, as you're sitting there watching TV, you're just fine. But it's when you cough, sneeze, run, it's when the horse spooks, it's over a big jump and a hard landing. Those would be stress incontinence things. When I'm lifting something heavy, or I feel a high amount of pressure come onto my system and I have a little bit of leakage. You can have both. So just know that both versions can occur.
We have another question here.
Go for it.
How is the pelvic floor affected if you have a vertical bowel resection?
Vertical bowel resection. So I cannot speak to knowing exactly what that procedure is, but I can only imagine there's scar tissue that's involved to some degree. And then you are no doubt then tinkering with the musculature of the pelvic floor. So their ability to re-synchronize with the rest of the system. So just know that within the bowel, there's little valves. We know like at the top of our stomach, there's a valve that closes. At the other end of our stomach, there's a valve that empties the stomach into the intestines, and all throughout your intestines, there's these little valves, these on and off, open closed valves. And those happen to open and close all the time, but it does give our brain a sense of like, where is our food in the system? And as you get to the end of the bowel, there's an internal sphincter and an external sphincter. So without knowing that surgical procedure exactly, if it interrupted the internal sphincter, that is what tells your brain, hey, there's some stuff on deck that needs to get taken care of. And then it can still pass through that internal sphincter down to your external sphincter. But that middle zone is usually where you're buying time. So if that has been impacted and changed in any capacity, that also might make it, difficult to have a sense that you need to get to the restroom prior to like it's happening. So that's the best that I can answer without a super precise knowledge of the procedure itself. At the very end, I'm going to talk to you about another resource, which is the pelvic health therapist that I work with and co-treat with clients. And she is then the expert in all things kind of more medically involved with pelvic organs too. Constipation and withholding, those are really tricky because a lot of that can become, I just am not active I'm inactive all day, and without that movement of my body, things can just literally pile up and back up within your bowel. Thinking also about withholding as it relates to urine, you can, if you don't want to go pee and you consistently say, nope, 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 I'm not relaxing, that bladder can get over full and overstretched. So neither situation is good. And then, of course, there's a lot of nutritional factors to constipation, not enough fiber, dehydration, dehydration also can create that difficulty. And then you can also have neurological reasons for it. The bottom of your spine and where all the nerves come out, if any of those have pressure on them, you can sometimes lose control of your bowel and bladder function. And then behavioral, there's just people that are like, I will not go to the bathroom. I will not have a bowel movement outside of my house. Those things are more common than you might realize. And then, of course, in youth, they're just bashful. And I think they then also perhaps have a harder time nutritionally as well. Poor function of the pelvic floor. And what I mean by that is if you have a really rigid, tight, always on pelvic floor, you just have a hard time relaxing to have a full, complete bowel movement, or to fully let that bladder totally empty. So it's that hyperactivity that can also create some of these issues. Now, think to like when you ride your horse and you can just tell their rib cage is really tight and their hind end's not really engaged. Maybe they're passing a lot of gas, or they act like they're going to pee and then they don't. And now how much suppleness do you think you're going to get out of their spine movement, and how much activation do you think you're going to get without some tension within their system? So it goes the same way. We love it when our horse isn't, full and withholding, because they're going to move better. It's the same thing for us. I am not saying go pee just in case before you ride, but I am saying that if those are chronic behaviors that you struggle with, it pays in a horse capacity to pay. It pays to manage that. Plus, there's just a whole plethora of reasons why you don't want to have chronic constipation or withholding. Just a general health reason. So lastly, prolapse, that's just where the pelvic organs, so whether that's the uterus, the bladder, or the bowel, can start to descend beyond the height, or beyond the level of the pelvic floor. So within these openings, you can have dropping or descending out of those organs. Maybe it's a little, maybe it's only with a cough or a strain, or maybe it's substantial. So those always involve a specialist, a pelvic floor physical therapist, and certainly a more elaborate medical team. There's a lot of people that have had prolapses surgically managed with mesh to suspend and relift things, and how you go about recoordinating normal pelvic floor function from that is really important. Because again, sort of what I said before, scar tissue, and then lack of coordination, meaning, am I over tight? Am I too loose? And can I synchronize back in with those normal loops again? So those are all the things that can go wrong. Not a pretty picture, but so common. Just because it's common does not mean it's normal. So I always hate it when I hear like the 50 and 60-year-old women that are like, oh yeah, ever since kids, I always leak if I laugh too much. And, that's just how it is. And I'm like, no, it's not how it is. But that probably is what medicine led you to believe. Now we know so much more about how much can be accomplished with pelvic health physical therapy preventatively, right away after pregnancy or any pelvic surgeries, and certainly even beyond. It's never too late. Excuse me. So now let's talk riding. This list is what we're going to go over. Simply just making contact with the saddle is the most important part of the pelvic floor. Connecting our movements right to left. We talked about that a little bit last talk. Excuse me. The pelvic floor is also going to be that mediator of force from our legs up through our pelvis and then up into the spine. And then again, if I'm going to have downward force, like the carrying, the loading from my upper body, that pelvic floor is also part of what needs to manage that. So there's some up and down force management. And then a following seat and bowel and bladder control. Because obviously we still want that when we're in the saddle. Excuse me. So these are the differences for male and female pelvises. The main difference here. Oh, I don't want to dive into that quite yet. I just saw my notes. I'll leave this slide up. The riding implication, the number one most broad question that I kind of like to answer is riding good for our pelvic floor? Is it something that it's advantageous and it's great, and like, thank God we're horseback riders because we have wonderful pelvic floors, or is it something that is perhaps maybe a little bit of a barrier for ideal pelvic floor function? And the answer is it depends on the individual. What's nice though is there's been research that looked at active females in kind of like a consistent, if you think about like 1 hour a week, every week, at least for a year, that they've been active. They studied then in horseback riding activity versus just general like aerobic and weightlifting fitness. So just think like a typical gym workout. And they found that, and this is a study that was done in 2022, so fairly recently, they found that both versions of activity were helpful in improving pelvic floor function. So function was defined as, bowel and bladder control, sexual function, and then any organ prolapse presence. So they found that activity in general was better than the sedentary female group. However, the physical activity from horseback riding also produced extra and more advantageous function for bowel control, which I find fascinating. Why specifically bowel function? I don't know. I think it's just an interesting research finding, but the general support, though, it should tell you that being active and specifically being a horseback rider, at least 1 hour a week for at least a year, puts your pelvic floor functionality above the rest, which is great. And it's interesting because, yes, it's the body movement of strength, your inner thigh strength, and you're holding your pelvic floor with this bouncing horse. But they also found that it was the amount of postural awareness. So subtleties like, our upper body and our breathing. And then also the social and emotional connections that came from participating in this sport. Meaning we're happier individuals, we're more committed to coming to the barn. So that program glue that we stick to is what makes this way more fun than like, here's your Kegel workout, enjoy. Like, this is a really, really fun way to, as we all know, a really great way to stay overall physically fit and active. And that certainly applies to your pelvic floor. I wanted to mention that. So in the saddle, the contact points, we talked about that pubic symphysis, that is in contact with female riders with the pommel of the saddle. So this front part. Now where we came down our abdomens and landed was on the top. But this is a fairly tall joint. So about 2 inches further down, that's where the pommel of the saddle would gently be supporting. You sit on your 2 seat bones, and then your lesser trochanters, which I'm going to change models here. Your lesser trochanter are these little knobs on the top of your thigh bones. So your greater trochanter is what you feel when you feel your widest point of your hips. And then on the inside of that is the lesser trochanter. So lesser trochanters, seat bones, and then if you're a female, a little bit of contact with technically the bottom of that pubic symphysis. Men just logically don't want to put that on the saddle. So that's the difference. But if you look at the picture, you can see then the anatomical difference between male and female pelvises. Women's pelvises are substantially wider and shorter, and male pelvises are narrow and a little bit taller. And they did a little overlay so you could see that difference on the right side. The contact points that we talk about, so we're going to this muscle and nerve picture. That saddle, rises up underneath us from right to left. So any type of pressure that sits on nerves or, the blood vessel systems that are weaving through our pelvic floor, but in particular, nerve pressure can be a big issue if that gullet is wide and too wide, or too raised, too high. You're going to have excessive pressure on just, inherently delicate structures. It's not like you have a ton of tissue protection, like skin or fatty layer protection in this part of your body. So it is important from a saddle fit standpoint simply things such as chafage and excessive friction with excessive moisture, points out the need for really good moisture wicking and properly fitting riding pants. So there's just, there's not a lot of room for error here. You want things to be dry, well fit in terms of clothing, well fit to the best of your ability for your body. And I think we all know there's a huge change in the amount of custom saddlery going on now versus, 20, 30 years ago. So that's all really positive. The next thing for us is to just understand a couple of the other connection points to this pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor isn't on this picture, but this is just a quick reminder that your inner thigh muscles go up and attach to the inner border of your seat bone. And then these little rings, they're connecting the seat bone to the pubic bone. You can feel this. This is like what I would call like your bikini line. You can feel this bony edge. And to the inside of it is the pelvic floor. And on these bony edges are the connections of your inner thigh muscles. So I'm talking like, a couple millimeter neighbor. It is very, very close. So they share the attachment points and share fascia with your pelvic floor. So this means if you have a trigger point in your pelvic floor muscles, because either they're overused or underused, so you get like a knot in the pelvic floor muscle, it can send pain to the inner thigh. I am also saying if you have really tight inner thigh muscles, it can lead to discomfort along your pelvic, like within your pelvic floor. They share sensory experiences and they share proper functioning. So it is really, really important that your inner thigh muscles stay stretched. And we did some stretches for those last talk. The other interesting point is your glute muscles. The importance of your glutes were to keep your pelvis level in the saddle and to create rotational abilities in that thigh bone. And a lot of people talk to me about their piriformis muscle being tight, or, I have piriformis syndrome. And what's really interesting is you can actually palpate your piriformis muscle from internal pelvic floor work. So from the standpoint of like, if a physical therapist, couldn't address a knot or a tension on this outer layer of the pelvic floor, it's, the next one's deep, then they just use their finger and can go in and palpate those muscles, including your piriformis and including your obturator internus. So those muscles that sometimes are problematic or tight are limiting your hip range of motion. And you're like, you can sit on a tennis ball, you can massage them, you can stretch them. You sometimes have to go internally to fully release the connection points that are part of your pelvic floor. So that's just super interesting stuff. For those that have done traditional physical therapy and are saying, I've had those muscles massaged so many times and they just always are tight. It may be they are part of a dysfunctional system of behavior in your pelvic floor, or you just need to release them from internal physical therapy work. All I can say is, if you just sit and hold pressure, fingertip pressure, that's how we release these pelvic floor trigger points. It's sit and sustain pressure. It's nothing funky. It's very, very subtle and casual work. So I don't, for people that are like, oh boy, no, I don't ever want any internal work done. Sounds really painful, or it just sounds like I don't want to do it. It's literally just sit and hold. And that's all these muscles need to release some of the trigger points. Okay. Core muscles come down and attach to that pubic symphysis. We talked about this with that cesarean question, but then also the biggest, most pronounced separation of an abdominal muscle that can happen with pregnancy. But the biggest one I've seen was of this I don't know, like 45-year-old, um, this 45-year-old gentleman, I'm trying to remember what he did for a living. I forget what he did for a living, but fairly inactive. But had a great classic Wisconsin beer belly. And every time he got up off the table, his belly would dome up. It would just pop right up in the middle. And that doming occurs when the core muscles aren't like attached and congruent to each other. So you can see these pictures of different types of tearing, if you will, separating of the muscles. So after pregnancy, and then with pronounced core weakness with a lot of abdominal strain, such as chronic weight that even gentlemen can carry. So if these muscles separate to the point where they're so far apart, the risk is that with an abdominal contraction, you can have a slight herniation or bulging out of your intestines. So it is important to not overwhelm the strength of your core when you're in a state of diastasis. It is inevitable that during pregnancy, there's going to be some gapping, and then 2 fingers of a width is considered. So like you can feel on your own belly, there's this, I'm going to say like a seam of connective tissue, and you usually can feel that. And then if you've never carried a baby or totally have recovered or just have a good strong core, it should be fairly narrow. But during or after pregnancy, a width of 2 fingers is considered normal. If it's beyond 2 fingers, now we have an official, it's categorized as a diastasis, and you don't want to do a ton of crunches or heavy sitting up without reintegrating and restabilizing that core through physical therapy. A lot of people go throughout life with these and don't even realize it. The proper way to test doing it is lay down, find that seam, hold your finger there, and then lift your head up off the bed or the floor, and you'll be able to feel if that line gaps or widens with an abdominal activity like that. The pressure management. So this is where we're going to start to answer the first question, which is what should my pelvic floor have been doing when I inhaled and exhaled? So the picture A, diagram A, is an inhale. My diaphragm drops down as I inhale, and as I exhale, it comes back up. So the pelvic floor should mirror that. On inhale, your pelvic floor should drop or relax, elongate. And then on exhale, it lifts up and it helps to push that air up. So why don't we all go find our fingertip again, just inside the seat bone, and do that inhale. And notice, does that finger somewhat, and I'm talking tiny, 1/4 of an inch, tiny, does that finger drop down towards my feet when I inhale? And for those that are like, nope, it doesn't do that. You probably have a fairly tense or higher tone of muscle activity in your pelvic floor. It does not know how to let go. And this is a vast, vast majority of horseback riders. These are the people who just the degree of stabilize, hold, high intensity expectations, I'm more anxious, I'm worried, I'm fearful about riding. These people tend to have more rigid pelvic floors that don't relax on inhale. And then on exhale, do you feel like your finger goes back to its starting position? So this is a relaxed exhale we're doing right now. So inhale, it drops down. Exhale, just relaxed. Back to resting length. Diagram B is when we kind of do a forced exhale, like a cough. Clear our throat. Blow bubbles into a drink with a straw. the technique we'll talk about with half halting. That pelvic floor should actually lift and rise up. This, unfortunately, is where people are like, well, now my finger's dropping when I cough or when I clear my throat. And I'm like, oh, yes, that is poor pressure management. So I'm going to make sure everyone has this. Inhale, there's a dropping as this balloon fills, if you will, of our abdomen. And then on exhale, with a relaxed exhale, it just goes back to resting position. With a forced exhale, coughing, clearing your throat, pursed lip breathing, it should lift up. Any questions there? When we talk, so think about people who talk for a living or trainers that are talking and have to project their voice across the ring. This is a lot of lifting and contracting of the pelvic floor, engagement of the core muscles to push air out. There's one final dome that is not in these pictures, and that is your epiglottis. So it's this little flap that closes over your windpipe when you swallow food, so it doesn't go down your windpipe and you choke. That epiglottis actually forms a third pressure management system. That if you imagine on the picture, it'd be drawn in with that third red line. So how we talk and the tone of our voice is actually going to become a tool to ensure that we have, correct pressure management with our pelvic floor and our diaphragm. So this is a cool one. The very first thing, this pelvic floor physical therapist friend of mine who gave me this model, she came out to the barn with me a couple years ago, and I wanted her to work with a rider who had a history of some pelvic floor dysfunction. And this pelvic floor, her name's Lauren. She doesn't ride horses, but I, had her learn the basics and, had her ride a horse for a couple laps around, and she had a light feel for it at that time. And I said, what would you do to help this rider figure out her pelvic floor? And she said, I want her to do a super low voice, like, oh, easy, whoa. And that is a change in your epiglottis and vocal cord pressure that would correlate with relaxing the pelvic floor. And then she said, I want the rider to do everything really high pitched. Doot, 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 let's go. Doot, 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 come on. Ah, ah, ah. And that is a contraction of your vocal cords, a contraction of your pelvic floor. So you can play around with the pitch of your voice to try to influence that pelvic floor without even thinking about Kegels, whatever. If you're just like, I can't feel that, I can't figure that out, just play with the tone of your voice. And I thought that was a great way for that rider who had so much irritation, just the whole concept. She was just like, I had this and this and this, and I don't feel anything. And it just was not a place we wanted to work. We played with her voice. So a fascinating thing about these pressure management domes. Riding requires just a phenomenal amount of movement, as we know, but specifically that pelvis goes up and down. It can go front to back. And then just the following of the horse, even like forward, right, forward, left. So there is a little bit of shear and rotation within that pelvis. So all those muscles, if you can think back to the beginning in anatomical photo, all those different angles of muscles become really helpful, because no matter where that pelvis is in the moment of following, there are muscles there and ready to manage this pressure. But if you are that rigid, I don't move with my inhale person, you've lost the pliability of your pelvic floor, and therefore you won't be able to follow on all those dynamic patterns that the horse is asking you to. So if you're like, well, I stretch my hip flexors and, I stretch all my leg muscles, and I'm belly breathing and I'm soft in my spine, but you might still be rigid in your pelvic floor, which still prevents a little bit of the natural following that should occur.
We have a question now.
Yeah.
So when we give vocal rewards to our horse with a high pitch, are they getting tension from the PF, excuse me.
The pelvic floor.
Should we give a reward in a low tone?
Yeah. I don't want us to overthink the yes, that's it. Yes, just a split second of it isn't going to be a thing. But if you're habitually in a high tone voice, like fairly frequently, throughout your ride, I don't mean to be mean, but there's just some people that just have high tone voices all the time. They're just like that. Oh, their voice is so, ugh. They're probably walking around with tight pelvic floors. But I do think it's a nice thing if you're worried about being over tight. And as we're trying to relax and reward that horse, or maybe we're finishing up with a couple movements that were really challenging. Yeah, drop that voice. Good job. Yes, good boy. I find as I do talks like this, in particular, 2 months after having a baby, I'm feeling fatigue in my vocal cords. Most likely because my pelvic floor right now is getting tired just from sitting here talking. This is a pelvic floor workout for me. So it is even one of those things where you might want to test your ability without getting raspy or tense in your throat. Can you narrate your ride? And if you can't calmly and smoothly vocalize, it might be another cue that you're secretly fatiguing or clenching in that pelvic floor. I should clarify. Fatigue, most people think it means like flapping, all stretchy. What fatigue can also mean is I don't have good articulation of that pelvic floor. For every time I'm talking, that pelvic floor isn't smoothly pushing air out. And so it starts to get a little short-winded, or I can't be as loud. So I'm fatiguing in my pelvic floor. And then what happens is your body's like, well, I can't smoothly articulate, so let's just grip. And then the next thing that happens is flapping out, totally overstretched, kaput pelvic floor. So usually we notice poor control, shakiness, shorter endurance, and then a clench. And then the next thing would be a totally flaccid pelvic floor.
Here's another question on breathing and would a low sound breathing help keep your seat in the saddle in a canter?
Low sound.
Like I think what she's talking about is something like, yeah,
Yeah. Like a hum or a moan kind of
yeah.
thing. Yes. Yes, it is part of following and dropping, and kind of, if you look at these two pictures, right? If you look at this relaxation of exhale, I'm actually making space to kind of drape over the saddle.
Interesting.
Oh, I'm sorry. On exhale, that is forced is B, but I will also say a relaxed pelvic floor will just take the shape of the saddle.
That makes sense.
But if I'm a rigid pelvic floor, I'm like a straight line red, and the saddle's not able to create any indentation. And I'm also probably not doing a good job of relaxing and taking full breaths. So I'm building tension into my system. They say pregnancy was just on my brain. During labor, you're not supposed to yell. That's like a forced exhale, tensing your pelvic floor. But moaning or groaning is a relaxation of it. So, canter horses, birth babies. There you go. We are switching now. We're going to stand up, and I suppose if you really wanted, you could find this in sitting, but we're going to stand up because it's going to lead to our first activity to try to find proper engagement and contraction of our pelvic floor. And we're going to find neutral on our pelvis. Just before I get too far from the screen, this front point of our pelvis and the back point of our pelvis that we are going to find. This is the view you have in your on your screen right now. But I'm going to show you the back view from the back view where this pelvic bone meets the sacrum. So your iliac crest meeting your sacrum. Right here is, for most people, kind of where those little thumbprint indentations are that naturally sit within their back, right at that belt line, because these are like little indentation opportunities. So when I feel is someone's sacrum level, I put my two thumbs right here. So if you can kind of find those thumbprints, that'll help you find the posterior dot, and then the front point. You're going to follow your pelvic bowl, and then the first place that kind of drops off. So I'll show you how to find that on the entity of me next. So that front, so go forward off this little brim of your pelvis, and right where it drops off, kind of feels like a cliff. That's the easier place to find for most people. And then if you just take your hand and try to, reach back with your thumb, unless you have fairly big hands and a tiny pelvis, you're probably not going to get to that posterior point, but that's going to get you pretty close to the level of it. So then you're going to continue back until you find those little dimples or thumbprints. So I'm going to hold the thumbprint, come back to the front, find my little cliff, and then are those 2 points level? And this is what everyone is just so desperate to know about their riding position, is do I have a neutral seat? I would love to be like this at rest, which would be a forward or an anterior tilt. This would be neutral, and tucked this way would be slouching and sitting in the really squishy couch, all rounded in, or more of that chair seat. So again, finding those points, you can find the front cliff, roughly toss your thumbs back there, and then go closer to the spine until you sink into your little divots. And then I'm keeping a thumb, finding it. You can play around with just using your camera screen right now, or, in the bathroom mirror would be really helpful. But this is what I watch when I watch riders. And what's important about this is when I'm posting, let's say, when I sit down on the fall part of rise and fall, my pelvis in dressage should be 0 degrees of a tilt, or maybe 5. If I'm sort of in a lighter seat, if I'm in the beginning of my ride, because I'm anticipating coming up to follow. But at the top of my post for a dressage rider, I should be level. So sitting level, maybe a little bit anticipating the rise of the horse's spine. So 0 degrees to 5. 5 degrees is tiny. And then if I'm a hunt seat rider or eventer, I'm probably going to sit with about a 10-degree tip. And then at the top of my rise being a 10-degree tip, because I'm following the angle of my forward seat all the time. So I'm technically neutral to my angled spine. Here's the problem. I measure a lot of people at like a 30-degree forward tilt in both disciplines. So it is really common that is too far forwards. When we're looking at these pelvic floor muscles, we do have an impact when our pelvis is tilted forwards versus tucked under versus being in neutral. So the muscles of the pelvic floor, if overstretched or understretched, or if one half of the pelvis is tipped forwards and the other one's neutral, we're messing around with that length tension relationship. And that changes your ability to feel contraction and for a coordinated contraction to occur. So here's a cool thing. We're standing. I'm going to have you guys, we already tried to do that little contraction of our pelvic floor. I'm going to have you, if you can, find that little spot just the inside of your seat bone. So find your seat bone, tuck one finger just within. And then I want you to, if you can see my feet, I want you guys to lift your toes up and try to contract your pelvic floor. And then I want, my little paper thing is black in it here. But you can see my toes. Lift my toes up and try to do that contraction of your pelvic floor. And then push your toes down into the floor. So lifting both toes up at the same time is a balance challenge. So if you need to hold on, please do. And you guys try to determine, does it feel like you're able to get a more clear feel of your contraction or a stronger contraction when your toes are up versus your toes being down? And then I want you to notice that when we're toes up, that pelvis tends, this is the front, this is the back, and we lifted our toes up. The pelvis tends to tip forwards to counterbalance. And when we push down, that engagement of the back of your calves can feed into a little bit of the engagement of the back of your hamstrings or glutes. So there can be a slight posterior tilt. But for sure, when we tip forwards and have that balance challenge, we have to go into an anterior pelvic tilt. And there's a study done with the correlation of pelvic floor activity to the pelvis movement. And it was found that when you plantar flex or push your toes down, it inhibits the activity of your pelvic floor. And when you lift your toes up, it activates your pelvic floor, your pelvic floor. So when in this study, they made a really strong connection to the fact that you need to have the ability for your toes to come up for your pelvic floor to engage, particularly when you land from jumping. So I thought that was a nice connection, excuse me, back into the pressure management. Precisely at that big landing point, we have our pelvis in a place where it can activate. This is also when you struggle to find your pelvic floor contraction, you can try just lifting your toes up. Whether you're laying down or sitting, just that little bit of lift and hold can start to correlate in a little bit more of the other muscles that live on the same circuit of your pelvic floor. So, excuse me, those throat muscles, your breathing muscle, your abdominal muscles, pelvic floor. There's lots of doorways into this pelvic floor. These are common barriers I have listed in terms of being able to effectively ride with our pelvic floor. We talked about too much activity. You can't receive movement from that saddle, therefore the horse's spine. And you have more difficulty following. But this is where I do think we have to think about the psyche of it, right? So am I nervous, anxious? Even just, I don't want to disappoint the trainer. You have these sort of expectations put on you. Lots of subtle increases of tension that can kind of plow right to the pelvic floor.
Right. I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first one, does the horse generally respond to tension when your pelvic floor is contracted and tight?
Yes. And you'll have to it's just going to blow your little minds when you sit on your horse's back and you try this for the first time. the first time I did this, I was on a horse that like when you go to pick up the reins, it starts bobbing its head, like, okay, here we go. And they start adding intention. So I'm like, well, I'm going to back this down to, I'm just going to do a kegel. And the horse goes, like, oh, here comes tension into the system. Or I'll get an ear flick when you do a pelvic floor contraction, like, oh, they're getting ready to do something. So yes, they do. How they
Okay,
might express it, maybe it's different for each horse, but they feel it.
so there's another one here. So if a rider is jamming or working very hard to keep their heels down, are they contracting the pelvic floor? Are they over contracting the pelvic floor?
Yeah, yeah. There certainly could be that fact, yes. And I'm trying to think about too, when people are trying to push their heels down, to me, there's like a real drive down of the heel. And this study that I alluded to was more of like a real strong, poignant lift of the toes. So how much they're activating their shin muscles versus stepping into our stirrup and driving down. Sometimes it's more of like a weight. We're just trying to really shove a heel down with our weight. But yes, it is certainly a strong potential that that's happening.
Well, and when you do that, when you jam your heel down, a lot of times it pushes the leg forward out of position.
Yep. And that pelvis is going to go to counterbalance you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, this is kind of to this second point. When there's tension in other places, here's a rider like many of you are going to be that's going to get on and try to have this like following seat. And now you're going to try to practice feeling your pelvic floor with breath, but it's like, meanwhile, do you still have tension in your jaw or throat? Meanwhile, are you still holding tension in your inner thighs? So what's really hard is that pelvic floor is highly connected. I'll say it again, to jaw muscles, your breath and your diaphragm, and then that pelvic floor. And shares connecting muscles to your inner thighs and some of those two deep glute muscles, your piriformis and your obturator internus. I accidentally progressed my slides. There we go. So if you have tension in your butt muscles, inner thighs, altered breathing, or in your jaw, and you're like trying to just relax your pelvic floor, that's what you're going to find quite difficult.
Doesn't it also, one time an instructor said to me, wherever you're tense is where your horse is going to be tense.
Yes.
Okay. So
Yes.
if you're while you're trying to relax your pelvic floor, you're gritting your teeth.
Yeah.
Look and see what's going on with your horse's head.
Yeah. And this is interesting because I went back to my memory banks, if you will. And I used to always do this when I would show. I would push my tongue up on the top of the roof of my mouth. And it was just like, whatever. I just thought it was this little nervous habit I had. But knowing now, it's like, man, I bet I was probably gripping more with my inner thighs and probably holding that like anxious energy in my pelvic floor and was holding my breath. And so, yeah, I have this memory of that experience. And then, I'm sure my horse had a tight jaw too. So it's just
Yeah.
it's very interesting to keep this circuit breaker in mind. You guys are doing a great job gaining knowledge today, but many other riders just have such a lack of knowledge of the pelvic floor. And then again, things such as fear or embarrassment or trauma to this area are reasons why, you don't want to talk about it. You don't feel comfortable learning about it with the trainer. So it's a delicate area. You have to come in with an open mind, which you guys all have, but you might not be able to have a great conversation with a rider, this weekend in the ring. Hey, check out this pelvic floor thing I did. Just you never know what you're walking into with these things. Or they'll love it. You never know. So let's start practicing some activities. And this is where I'm going to point out the final study that was done was actually of horseback riders at rest versus, so meaning like at the halt, at a walk, trot, canter, and jumping. And the degree of pelvic floor strength logically got higher and higher, the activation, if you will, got higher and higher. And the highest was in a 2-point. And then I want to keep this in mind because it's sort of like if you were to think about an analogy of getting stronger in your biceps, you don't go and pick up the 20-pound weight off the weight rack. You start with the little ones, and then you get bigger and bigger and bigger. So, you may find that you're really successful at the halt and kind of, I can do this at the walk and then at the trot. Oh, nope, I lost it. Or now I'm tensing in one other place in that circuit breaker. So just that's how you're going to grade the strength training, if you will, of your pelvic floor on the horse. And then this also is where if you were to look at a horseback rider off the horse versus a non-horseback rider off the horse, horseback riders have higher resting pelvic floor activity. And that's like great if you are someone who uses that strength appropriately when needed. That is not great if you're the person with the high resting tone, incessantly all day. So having a strong pelvic floor is wonderful only if you have a really well-controlled ability to relax and coordinate that strength only when needed. So if you're someone who felt when we did this, does relaxation feel distinctly different than contraction? Does it feel squishy? Does it feel soft? Great. Continue on with strengthening. If you're like, no, it kind of always felt tense no matter what I did, don't start practicing activating it. You are already way too good at that. You need to be practicing relaxation, which is the second thing we'll get to. So the contraction visuals that I have, vocally, I told you, as an idea, try not to pee. That's a common one. But another one that seems to kind of just help everyone's pelvic floor really get the lift aspect out of contraction is trying to imagine like picking up something with your with your girl parts, like picking up a blueberry or picking something up and holding it. Another analogy that I've heard is like trying to hold a tampon in. There's this upwards visual to that versus a contraction that's going to create a downwards drop or bulging pressure. That downwards pressure should only happen with bearing down. And bearing down should only happen when you're pushing out a baby or a very large bowel movement. It should not occur when you're lifting or trying to activate your pelvic floor in any other capacity. So a pelvic floor contraction should create a lift. My fingers should get closer to my chin when I contract. And then what you're going to do is you're going to start to have a 2 to 3, I don't want that to fall. Here we go. A 2 to 3 second hold. That's considered like a roughly good place to start for your endurance. If you can think back to how long you were trying to hold your pelvic floor contraction, whether it was right or wrong in technique, how long do you think you could hold it? If you could do 2 or 3 seconds, great. That's a pretty typical average starting place. A fully strong, perfectly enduranced pelvic floor, should be able to last 10 seconds. No weakening, no dropping, no shaking. Just a pure 10-second hold up of that blueberry. As I am breathing regularly and not tensing anywhere else on the circuit breaker. That is super hard. But if there were ever an athlete that could do it, the research does say a horseback rider should be able to do it, right? Like if you are an avid, a professional riding every day, multiple horses, yeah, that pelvic floor should be able to hold for 10 seconds while you breathe normally. So let's say you're like, yeah, I could do it for 2 seconds. You're going to then do that 2-second lift and hold, trying to breathe normally. And then you're going to do that for 5 times. So I'm going to go 1, 2, relax. 1, 2, relax. Do that 5 times. And then you're going to do that 5 times, 8 to 10 times a day. So, for example, you're going to do those 5 holds for as long as you can every hour of the waking day. And this is the hard part, is when people want to get a stronger pelvic floor, it takes this much work. It takes this much frequency. And the typical plan of care of seeing a pelvic health patient is not like, I'm going to see someone 3 times a week and give them new things every 2.5 days. Yeah, no, I'm going to see them probably once a month, because the pelvic floor takes a long time to gain the amount of endurance to get ready for the next level of difficulty. And endurance is the number one thing you want before you make the challenge harder. So it's not like, okay, I can't do it for 4 seconds, but I'm going to squeeze really, really, really hard. Like, nope. First goal should be you can get to a 10-second hold sitting in a chair. Or if that's too hard, 10 seconds laying on your back so you don't have to hold your organs up. And then when you can get to the 10-second hold, then we start talking about adding overpressure or more difficult coordination tasks. But that 10-second goal, that's your first goal. Endurance first. The relaxation exercises, so feeling a distinct difference or a softness to your pelvic floor when things are off, really does involve those other components. So I might have you guys put your hands on your face, specifically like your cheek jaw muscles, so right below your cheekbone. And just play, it's hard for me to do while I'm talking, but just play around with like the right and left movement of your jaw, or just do some little circles on your jaw muscles. Sometimes closing your eyes and having a slow drag down of your fingertips are relaxation techniques at your jaw. Maybe it's a hot pack on your neck, or your hand on your belly and feeling your hand rise and fall with breath. These are relaxation ideas for other aspects of that circuit. And now you might go, yeah, now I can kind of feel the difference between a contraction of my pelvic floor, a lift of the blueberry versus letting it go. So it's not like you just sit there and go, come on, pelvic floor, relax, 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 relax. You got to go to other places on that circuit breaker. Maybe you're going to push gently down into the floor. So those are relaxation ideas. In the saddle, all that face stuff is accessible to you. A hand on your belly is accessible to you. I've also had riders just put a hand like right behind them on the horse's saddle pad and just feel the rise and fall of the horse's ribs. I'll ask them to talk about something fun, enjoyable, relaxing, peaceful. I'll actually remind people that horseback riding was meant to be enjoyable. And that kind of shakes some of that tension off. And then they can feel a little bit more following and soft in the pelvic floor. Questions on those two? It's the meat and potatoes right there. Can you activate it and can you relax it? And then when you can do a 10-second hold, or let's be more maybe realistic with ourselves, like 8 to 10 seconds and a decent relaxation, that's when I think it's fair for you to think about coordinating this with other things. So there's a trick I'll have newbies use, which is to take a big inhale and then to create that blueberry lift contraction on exhale. So you're asking for your pelvic floor to contract on exhale. and relax with inhale. Contract on exhale and relax on inhale. And then I'll start to say, well, that's a great way to start, but can you hold that contraction while you inhale and exhale? Or let's do the opposite. Can you contract the pelvic floor and inhale? Which means instead of that pelvic floor just going like, sure, let's inhale, it's going, okay, I'll kind of allow that. It's sort of slowly decelerating that breath versus going, yes, let's breathe in. Great idea, let's relax. It's going, okay, there's a little bit of tension, but it's still allowing that inhale. And then I'd say relax the pelvic floor on exhale. So you can sort of flip it. The other coordination is, can I then do this pelvic floor contraction as I stand? This is a great one for people that maybe have or had some stress incontinence. So once I add pressure to the system, that's when I feel leaking. So I would, feel your lower abdomen and take a belly breath in. I feel my pelvic floor drop into the table, and then I'm going to exhale and feel my core drop back down. Pelvic floor lifts the blueberry, and then I'm going to stand. So again, inhale, and then exhale. There's just this containment that occurs. And I'm saying containment from my core and my pelvic floor. That can occur with squatting. So I'm going to inhale, let everything relax and go wide and low. Exhale as I push up. Core comes in, pelvic floor lifts. Inhale, exhale. Relax my butt and my pelvic floor and my inner thighs, and then squeeze and engage and lift. And now that's starting to look like posting the trot. So coordinating it with your actual movements is another type of coordination. This is just another one that I think is kind of fun. It's a novel task, if you will, but it does come in from a nice standpoint if you have stress incontinence, like where you cough or sneeze or laugh, and that's when you leak a little bit, or when you have these sudden big movements on the horse. So what I'm going to have you guys do is do a quick contraction of your pelvic floor. So a really quick lift, and then slowly relax. You don't have to coordinate this with your breathing at all. It can just be a quick whoop and slowly relax. And the quickness of your contraction is what saves you when you have the quick movement of the horse, the quick loading of pressure from a sneeze. It's the quick reaction time. You don't need to hold for 10 seconds here. You need like 1 solid second. And then you're going to flip it. So you're going to do a really slow contraction, and then just drop that contraction and relax. These are the things you can do well on your drive. This is what you can do when someone's boring you in conversation, because you can't tell if you're doing Kegels or Kegels. You shouldn't be able to see it in the whole entity of you. It should be very subtle. The pelvic floor preparation exercises, this is a little bit of what I talked about. Like before we get out of sitting, we can integrate this this contraction. But what it more traditionally means is like, I'm about to sneeze, so I'm going to contract my pelvic floor before that sneeze. I'm about to pick up this hay bale, so I'm going to contract my pelvic floor before I do it. Things that I know are about to load me, I got that split second that I can engage and rev up my pelvic floor. Lastly, the nitty-gritty of application. So as you progress through those gaits, so halt, walk, trot, posting trot, and then sitting trot, and then cantering where you sit and follow, and then cantering up in a half seat or 2-point for jumping. It's really important you find on and off. What on traditionally means to a horse is, get ready, here we go. We're about to do something. Let's add impulsion. I'm coming on with pressure, so move forwards to get rid of me, to get rid of that pressure cue. And then off would then mean soften, relax, slow down. However, I think off of your pelvic floor can also mean just, I'm just going to coast here. Like, I don't need us to get faster or slower. I just want to follow. So if I relax my pelvic floor, but I still am active with maybe my leg aid, or I'm engaged with my core still, I'm now just trying to listen and get a feel for what my horse is doing. But if I'm off and I'm taking a big, slow exhale and my leg aids are coming off, well, now my pelvic floor is really signaling, let's go down to the walk and take a walk break. So on and off are really important to feel. I also don't want you guys thinking the pelvic floor is activity in riding is an incessant kegel. I'm using it during a request and then my mind's off of it. And that is why all the investment of the time you're spending off the horse, building your pelvic floor strength and resting behavior is important. It's all the other stuff you're doing that maintains the tone of your pelvic floor. And then you're just adding more or taking away specifically during a request when you want to change something. Using the different pitches and tones of voice we talked about. You guys can try this just right now and feeling your pelvic floor, and then go like la 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 la, ti ti ti, ha ha, high. And then go to low. So we talked about that already with just how we would narrate our ride to ourselves, maybe how we would instruct somebody else, or how we give our rewards to our horse. The half halt, these are two different options, and they really depend on the degree of self collection your horse is capable of. So if your horse is, pretty beginner, still not, or I shouldn't say self-collection, self-carriage, sorry. If they don't have a ton of self-carriage yet, you are going to probably be half halting with a sense of like, let me help you decelerate yourself, horse. So I would do like one of those pursed lip exhales. Like I'm blowing bubbles through a straw into my drink, so that my core is contained, my pelvic floor is lifting and contracting, and I'm taking a little bit of tension in my body. So my horse goes like, why isn't she not following? What I like about that is when your horse is used to you and your pelvic floor on its back, and your pelvic floor goes, oh, I'm coming up, they will come up a little bit and rise into you as they sit under and decelerate. So when you have that horse that needs a little bit of that deceleration and added effort, my half halt is an exhale with a contraction of my pelvic floor. If your horse is pretty well, balanced, has good self-carriage, then my half halt is usually just taking a nice smooth inhale, and I'm just going to exhale and let go of my pelvic floor altogether. It's a let go. So maybe I inhale and let go. And what I mean by letting go is I let it drop. But for most people, It's a lot easier to take a big inhale, and then we associate relaxation on exhale. So you can inhale, let your pelvic floor fill, and then just let it come to a soft middle ground. So that's just melt over the saddle. Versus, and now I'm lifting away from the saddle. And then lastly, the pelvic floor, the right and left half of your pelvic floor, I will have riders in lateral work. So say you want to do a leg yield to the left, I would have them think about contracting their right half of their pelvic floor. So try that right now. Like, I just want to contract the right side and then just the left side. You might find that like the right side or left side of your core is aiding in this, or a difference in like inner thigh or glute tension, because I can unilaterally apply these core, inner thigh, and butt fairly easily. And that's one way to help impact only using that half of your pelvic floor. So use those other circuit ideas, but just half of your circuit. And that would help close the right side and allow for, less pressure and an invitation to go into a left leg yield. So those are some fun ways to play around with this. I'm going to save some of this last time for questions. Please, like, I'm going to say this, but like, if I were you, I would like totally get on my horse tomorrow and like try this with half halts and try this with lateral work and go for it. Feel free. But I really, really do mean, if you don't feel like your contraction lifts and your at rest is even in tension and your inhale drops and fills, you really want to have a good understanding of pairing this with breathing and knowing what a good contraction feels like and a distinct relaxation feels like. So try these little things, that's fine, but don't expect your performance to be perfect or persistently perfect, because you're probably going to fatigue or get things mixed up unless you've practiced quite a bit outside of the saddle. Okay, questions?
None are showing up yet.
So like I said before too, if the questions are a little bit more personalized or private in nature, my email, I didn't go to my last slide. Let me put it back up so you guys can get to that information. That is my information there. And then lastly, if you're someone who has like a very evident history or difficulties with incontinence or surgical questions, the main educating, what am I trying to say, entity for pelvic health therapists it's called Herman and Wallace. So if you go to hermanandwallace.com and put in your zip code, you can find someone who's been trained. There's various levels of it. So I've done the first level of it of, external and internal work for bladder work. But then there's another level of it to work with bowel. There's another level of it to work with men and children. And then a whole bunch of different like subsets of applications. So point being, the therapists that really want to become specialized in this area have done their education through Herman and Wallace. So that is a nice resource for you guys to go to if you want some specific questions and an in-person assessment as well.
So the next thing that's come up on the chat is wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. What area does she practice in? What area?
So that's a good question. So I am based just north of Milwaukee, in Wisconsin. So, but I travel regionally quite often. So I am down in southern Wisconsin minimum once a month. So it is also a nice leadway into the fact that we have our in-person riding clinic coming up in April through the IDCTA hosting me. So that's a great time to come and ride or audit. But yeah, happy to travel.
It's going to be in Eagle, Wisconsin, just outside of Eagle, Wisconsin. And it's going to be a full day, 7 riders. So anyone who's thinking about it, it's on the website at this point, and there will be a e-blast that goes out in the next week or so. I want to thank you very much for this insightful presentation as part of the series of what we've been doing. And I just want to thank you. Every time I listen to you, I learn something new about what I'm not doing right.
I know. I know. Someone said to me the other day, she was getting ready to get on for a one-on-one session, and she's like, "My horse loves you because the focus is never on your horse. Everything's always my fault." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I
It's
guess
true. Yeah. Yeah.
that's kind of the point. I'm zoning in
Yeah.
on the people." So
Yeah.
you guys are all more than capable of doing this. So good luck in your practice, and we will see you guys next week.
Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great week, and we'll talk soon. I'm going to stop the recording.